Marion says of her service this morning, many people come to a Unitarian church after having been brought up in another denomination, but then finding their original religion just didn't work for them in adulthood. Today, Red River UU member Marion Hill will discuss the sometimes surprising journey of Frank Schaeffer, whose parents were missionaries to Switzerland and who, in young adulthood, became a leader of the religious right, but then rebelled against that life. In 3 best-selling books, one of which is titled Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God, he details the twists and turns in his thinking that brought him to a position of both belief and non-belief. Our first reading today is from Frank Schaeffer's book, Patience with God, Faith for People Who Don't Like Religion or Atheism. I believe that the ideological opposites, atheism and fundamentalist religion, often share the same fallacy. Truth claims that reek of false certainties. I also believe there is an alternative that actually matches the way life is lived, rather than how we usually talk about belief. I call that alternative hopeful uncertainty. And from Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God. So who is actually delusional? Who is actually following Jesus? Fundamentalist Christians rejecting gay men and lesbians' right to marriage, or atheist humanists treating men and women with love and dignity? Fact-based, enlightened atheists sometimes treat people like shit. And delusional fundamentalists sometimes miss a book event in order to help a lonely hotel mate. Labels don't mean anything. Who cares about labels when someone is slapping you in the face? Who cares about labels when someone is saving you from drowning? Who someone is and what they do is all that matters. Belief is never the point. Actions are. The very fabric of the universe is unknowable and stranger than we can imagine, and has a message for us. Climb down off that high atheist, religious, or agnostic pedestal. How we treat others is the only proof that we have. That proof is not found in any book. It is only found in the expression of unconditional trust we may sometimes see in the eyes of the people who know us best. Please welcome Marion Hill.
One reason I like the UU denomination is that no one in it tells me what I have to believe in order to be a member. Most UU members, in my experience, have come from other denominations in which they've grown up, but that they found didn't work for them in adulthood. That's true of both my husband and me. We grew up Southern Baptist and were both active in our churches, but as we encountered other beliefs and ways of thinking, we more and more questioned the dogma we were expected to believe. When we found this UU church, we realized that, like Goldilocks, we had found something just right for us. My own belief varies somewhat from day to day and year to year, since I admire aspects of many religions, the serenity of Buddhism, the formal beauty of liturgy in the Catholic and Episcopalian faiths, and the closeness to nature that's emphasized in pagan beliefs, especially in Native American tradition. But sometimes none of those work for me. Most UUs, I've learned, have gone on some kind of spiritual journey as they moved from the religion of their childhood and young adulthood to their mature faith or lack of faith, and I love hearing individual journey stories. These tend to vary a lot, but they have one thing in common. a searching spirit that rejects absolutism of thought, a willingness to consider variety in belief, and tolerance toward others' religions. Today I'm going to discuss the spiritual journey of Frank Schaeffer, who has now published several books about the fundamentalist evangelical religious tradition he grew up in, first as a believer and later as a more critical thinker. Frank grew up at an evangelical mission in a chalet in rural Switzerland, run by his parents, Francis and Edith Schaeffer. They called their mission l'abri, which is French for the shelter. They conceived of their alpine home as a shelter from the pressures of the 20th century and the secular world, catering to curious travelers who came there to discuss philosophical and religious beliefs with Francis and Edith. Frank at first was all in on his parents' religious views, as children tend to follow the religion they are born into, but the parents' attempt to homeschool Frank were a failure because their focus was on their mission, not on teaching him math, reading, and such. They then sent him to various religious schools, some of which he liked more than others. At one of these, a teacher disciplined children by embarrassing them. For instance, if a child had wet his pants, he was made to stand up on a table where everyone could see his wet pants. As an adult, Frank realized that his learning problems were at least partly because he had dyslexia, meaning that his eyes perceived letters differently than most people's do. Of his upbringing, he says, "I not only grew up in the fevered atmosphere of an American religious commune, L'Abri Fellowship, located in Switzerland, of all places, but at age 10, I was sent to an evangelical British boys' boarding school called Great Wallstead, where I encountered an easygoing and refreshingly new to me Anglican-derived faith that embodied a level of religious tolerance I wasn't familiar with. Later in life, the memory of that encounter shaped my sense that there might be better alternatives to the strict fundamentalism I was raised on." He began to have doubts about his parents' approach to religion while he was at Great Wallstead, but he pushed them down for a long time, and as a young adult became a leader of the religious right. He wrote books, delivered speeches, and made lots of money doing so. By the early 1980s, Frank says, at the height of my involvement in the evangelical fundamentalist religious right, I was invited to preach from Jerry Falwell's pulpit, appeared many times on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and met privately with many of the top Republican leaders of the day. In the midst of these heady experiences, I began to change my mind about what I believed, and not just about religion, but about politics too. His doubts continued and grew. He read books by a group of authors he calls the New Atheists, including Richard Rorty, Peter Singer, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins, and found much to agree with in their writings, including the statement that living an ethical life doesn't require belief in God. Atheists can live as moral a life as any religious person, Frank says. Quote, "Fewer than 5% of Danes attend church. In godless Denmark, the national government funds a high-quality education for all children, rich and poor alike, while in God-fearing America, education is funded through local property taxes, so neighborhood and income dictate a child's educational opportunities. Add in race and ethnicity factors to create a perfectly stratified school system segregated by educational opportunity. The godless Danes insist on paying their public school teachers well and according them prestige. No wonder teaching in Denmark is a competitive job, attracting the best and brightest men and women." A big part of Frank's problem with the fundamentalist evangelical view of Christianity that he was taught was in its portrayal of God. Quote, "If there is a creator by whatever name, then our very existence puts that creator on the side of life. Why would the creator be the enemy of his, her, or its own creation and anything or anyone in it, including a divine Son. Nature may be many things, but it is not petty, vindictive, and stupid, so why should we think God is? Can you imagine me consigning one of my grandchildren to oblivion because she had wrong ideas about me? Can you imagine me burning her forever because she didn't believe in me, forgot my name, or brought me fruit when I'd asked for lamb? I'm not a good man, and yet can you imagine anything that would cut my 4 grandchildren off from my love? He also finds it hard to fit many of the events that happen in the world into a concept of God's will. Where is God when a gunman shoots children in a school, or when a child is hanged in Auschwitz? Either God is evil and should be punched in the mouth, or there is no God. Which is it? Perhaps there is another possibility. Jesus' co-suffering love is the best lens through which to reconsider God, or at least to reconsider ourselves. Schaeffer does see things in the Christian tradition that he admires. Quote, "For all our massive failings, Christianity redefined the classical ideal of the worth of the individual. The inclusion of others is the greatest ethical insight of Christianity, because tribalism and excluding classes of people is the enemy of justice. Even thugs pay lip service to human rights these days, and in some places those rights are actually protected. How did we go from rapacious apes to the monks who produced the art, culture, life, and spirituality that pervade the cloisters, and to 10 Commandments style, thou shalt not proclamations that prohibited revenge, rape, and pillage, and replaced the selfish interests of the individual with the rule of law for the common good? The new atheists are correct that all these things could have happened without religion, but they didn't. They happened in all religion, all cultures, through religion. I do not always believe, let alone know, if God exists. I do not always know he or she does not exist either, though there are long patches in my life when it seems God never did exist. What I know is that I see the Creator in Jesus or nowhere. What I know is that I see Jesus in my children and grandchildren's love. What I know is that sometimes something too good to be true is true. These days I hold 2 ideas about God simultaneously. He, she, or it exists, and he, she, or it doesn't exist. I don't seesaw between these opposites. I embrace them. I don't view this embrace as requiring a choice between emotion and fact, or between evolutionary biology and spirituality. Reality can't be so neatly parsed. Neuroscientists who analyze our chemistry-based brains still fall in love. Preachers declaiming a literal view of the Bible and a so-called young earth still use petroleum products only found because geologists operate on the premise that the earth is 4.54 billion years old. My beef with the new atheists and with religious fundamentalists, he says, is that their ideas just don't seem aesthetically pleasing or imbued with the poetry that I experience in real life. Ideas about life are too small. Life trumps description, just as what some severely handicapped people actually grow up to do and be trumps sage theories on just whose life is worthy to be lived. Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, calls religion a virus and calls for antivirus intellectual programs to cure us of our religious illness. And he gives signs to look for to show that someone is infected by the virus, like some deep inner conviction that something is true. The points that Dawkins raises, Schaeffer says, sound less like science and more like a high school debate, wherein one debater has learned the trick of mentioning his opponent's beliefs first in order to strip them of their power, not by proving anything about them, by mentioning them in a disparaging way that puts the other person on the defensive. Refer to mystery with a sneer so that you strip the word of its power to remind people that there are indeed mysteries. Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great, Schaeffer says, sees evil all around him. He sees religion all around him, so religion must have designed the evil. Hitchens is entertaining, Schaeffer acknowledges, but says that in many of his arguments he seems to be mainly fighting with his brother Peter, who is a believer. How curious, Schaeffer says, that the Calvinist wing of the Protestant religion finds its soulmate in the atheist determinism. Both get rid of free will theoretically while demanding that their followers choose to go out and save the world with correct thinking, and both lace their demands with guilt. God hates you if you disagree with correct theology. Dawkins dismisses you as less educated if you question his ideas. God will get even for eternity, Dawkins with his next paperback. The comedian Bill Maher produced a movie in 2008 called Religulous, in which he makes fun of those who believe in God. Elbert and I regularly watch Maher's HBO program, but I find it annoying that he often seems to assume that only he knows the real truth about anything. Schaeffer finds Maher's movie funny, but he doesn't feel that the portrayal of religion is quite fair. He says that Maher reserved his ridicule, with one brief exception when he interviewed a scientist who is an evangelical, for the dumbest religious believers he could find. Schaeffer adds, he also seemed to think that religion, and Christianity in particular, is only about literal belief in the various biblical stories. It's not. It never has been. Schaeffer found himself about equally dissatisfied with fundamentalist Christianity and atheism. He ended up joining the Greek Orthodox Church and regularly attends one such church. He doesn't subscribe to all of that church's teachings and acknowledges that some people leave it because they find it too confining, but he finds the liturgy comforting and finds spirituality in the silence that he sometimes finds there. He says, I've never met an unequivocal atheist or religious believer. Atheists sometimes pray, and eloquent preachers sometimes harbor doubts. The evangelist Billy Graham preached certain salvation and heaven guaranteed, yet privately told my dad, a friend and fellow evangelist, that he feared death and had many doubts. We're all of at least two minds, Schaeffer says. He suggests that perhaps God leads his children to and through atheism as a stage on their journey. Maybe he does this for the same reason as any parents who want their children to grow up and think for themselves. Speaking of the deity, Schaeffer says, I have a love-hate relationship with God. Well, actually not with God, but with the people who have tried to define God in ways that the more tolerant earlier Christians didn't. My love-hate relationship is with fundamentalists who say they believe in God, and with people who are so sure there is no God that they've turned atheism into just another browbeating religion. Schaeffer isn't an agnostic, he says. An agnostic neither believes nor disbelieves in God. I'm not that person. I both believe and don't believe at the same time. Maybe we need a new category other than theism, atheism, or agnosticism that takes paradox and unknowing into account. I can't prove this, but I think that any person who remains a professional Christian in the evangelical fundamentalist world for a lifetime, especially any pastor, risk becoming an atheist and or a liar. Excuse me. Such individuals put on an act of certainty. Sooner or later they become flakes faking it, or they quit. Worse yet, some just stop asking questions. The very fact that a preacher can fool others when he or she has so many doubts makes the self-appointed mediator of faith the deepest cynic of all. That is, if he or she doesn't embrace paradox. If you have to be correct all the time, while knowing that you're wrong most of the time, you become an actor. Been there, done that. If you think that to be a Christian means you have to identify with a club you loathe, you'll have to choose to redefine your faith or lose it. The truth is, I believe that no one can prove the existence of God or the non-existence of God. Each can present what they see as evidence for their point of view, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will see it that way. In other words, what's convincing to some is not convincing to others. When I was a grad student at Stanford University many years ago, I saw a notice that someone was giving a lecture on campus titled On Proving the Non-Existence of God. I was still pretty much in the Southern Baptist way of thinking then, but I was curious about whether someone really could marshal proof for this opposing position. I don't recall who gave the talk, don't recall any specific proof that was offered, but I came away with the impression that those who already didn't believe in God were convinced by the speaker, and those of us who didn't already disbelieve in God, which likely included a few people in the audience who were wearing nuns' habits or clerical collars, went out unconvinced. Schaeffer's take on that proof idea is this: scientists and theologians can't offer better than circular arguments because there are no other kinds of arguments. Bible believers quote the Bible, and scientists quote other scientists. I think Reverend Forrest Church was onto something when he wrote The Cathedral of the World, a Universalist Theology. Church was for many years a senior minister at All Souls Unitarian Church in New York City. He was also the son of Frank Church, who some of you may remember as a senator from Idaho, who chaired the church commission many years ago that investigated wrongdoing by the intelligence agencies, CIA and FBI. Reverend Church's main point in his book is that the world is like a cathedral with windows all around it and a light in the center. The light can be viewed through many different windows, each of which gives a somewhat different perspective on it. The central light, or truth, doesn't change, but the view through each window does. That's his way of accounting for the many different religions that exist without saying any of them is wrong. Isn't that a better way of considering the variety of beliefs instead of killing each other because we think some others are wrong? Finally, these thoughts from Frank Schaeffer. The truth at the heart of why religion exists is that moral, metaphysical, spiritual, and aesthetic experiences are part of our lives. We learn as we do, not as we think about doing. And that is how faith in God is too. Sure, we who believe or try to, we who believe or try to have reasons, mostly made up after the fact, like my reasons for falling in love that I've discovered in hindsight. We either experience God or we don't. And just as in a marriage, once we have experienced God, we either choose to work to maintain that relationship or we let it fade. In that sense, we can choose to believe. What does this prove? Nothing, except the people who tell you that you must choose between rational intellectual systems and faith in God are lying. I think that most people, he says, are better than their official theology and or ideology. There are wars aplenty in the world, and hatred abounds, but there is also peace aplenty, and love abounds as well. There are extremists in all our camps, religious and secular, who'd kill the rest of us just to prove a point. They have the anger, or worse yet, the blind certainty of their correctness, but the rest of us have the numbers. The future belongs to the peacemakers.